start off by just asking the question, what is liberty? Is it something you just have? Is it a feeling? Is it an idea? The definition of liberty is the state of being free within a society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. Well, I believe that my liberty was violated in a very, very big way. I'll go back to kind of the beginning. I grew up on a cattle ranch just about 90 miles west of here, right at the base of the Continental Divide. And I experienced liberty every single day of my life when I was on the ranch. I'd be set free after breakfast and have the freedom to go work in the hayfield with my 3 brothers and all the hired men, or shovel the manure, or anything else that Dad had in line for us to do, but I was free to do it. With that also came the responsibility to do it, and there was no pink saddle that they put on my horse to say that I didn't have to get off and shovel that manure. And so I learned to shovel that, and it came in very handy years later when I worked in Washington, D.C. It really did. It was great. I was treated the same. I was expected to do the same. There was never any question that I was not capable enough of doing any job on the ranch. I'd figure out a way to do it. And I had to do it all without an excuse, period. So when I became a co-owner in a small business, we were a guardrail installation company, and all the jobs for highways, they're either bid with they're state funded or federally funded for the most part. Very few private roads. So we'd bid the jobs, my husband and I, and a lot of times we'd be low bid on the job, but we wouldn't get the work because it wasn't considered a disadvantaged business enterprise. It was considered a white male-owned company. Although I, a woman, owned the majority of the stock. I owned over 62% of the stock in the company. And I didn't want to become a disadvantaged business enterprise. I didn't grow up. I wasn't raised that I was disadvantaged. So why in the heck would I want to start now? To me, it was an insult that I would have to do that in order to compete in any industry. I just shouldn't have to do that. And it was a shock when we'd lose these jobs. So what I did, we lost job after job after job. And my husband would come home and complain about it night after night after night. And I frankly got really tired of hearing it. And I remember saying, either you shut up about this is the way business is going to be, or we're going to do something about this. I didn't know what, but I chose to fight because I thought, this is wrong. It's just as wrong whether it's in Colorado or whether it's in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter. And I had to find out, is this a state issue? Or is this a national issue? I didn't know. This was back in the 80s when a lot of these programs were just starting to take off. So what I did is I sent a letter to all the surrounding states of Colorado, to their Department of Transportation, and I asked them, what is your DBE program? And they told me. And I found out that there were quotas. They don't like that name, but that's what it was. And percentages. And I decided this is a national issue. This is not just a Colorado issue. And this is wrong. So I went to the Department of Transportation. I was knocking on their door. I would go testify when they would have hundreds lined up on the other side, testifying with their hand out how they need the percentages, they need the programs, and I would be the Lone Ranger there saying, no, we don't. I don't need to become a woman-owned business, DB business for that reason. And it just was entrenched, starting to get entrenched in our system. The more I spoke out, the more angry they got at me. In fact, one time, her name was Barbara Steffens. She was the EEO officer for the Department of Transportation. I had finally decided I better get myself organized, and I got a handful of contractors to come join me and speak out about how this was affecting their livelihood and their businesses. And she was very angry with me. She said, afterwards, she came up and why did you do this? how could you get these people? And I pulled out her letter that she had written to all the other contractors to show up, and I said, you did it? I can do it. See, when they've been the squeaky wheel, that is true. You kind of get the grease. So if you can't be a squeaky wheel, you're not going to get anything. You're not, if you don't have the gumph or whatever to take a stand, it's just not going to get you anywhere. So I decided this is not right. I can't do anything with CDOT. I went to the state capitol. I was knocking on doors. I couldn't get a legislator to listen to me except for one. And he was one of our own Republican or not, doesn't matter, I guess, but he was, you would think, a fairly conservative guy, a dairy farmer out of Colorado Springs. It was Senator Ray Powers. And I thought, I'm probably going to get a friendly ear here. No, I was wrong. What Senator Powers did is, when I gave him 5 minutes of time, is pat me on the head and say, Val, just be quiet. Just be quiet. You know, be a good little girl and just play the game. Become that DBE company and play the game, even if you didn't earn the job. And I found out that a lot of companies front their companies with women and minorities. They're no more down there running the company than the guy sitting across town from them. It doesn't happen. So they're fronted. In fact, on the road to the Supreme Court, I found out there are whole states that companies are fronted. So it's a scam. And actually, when it came down to it, as a woman, I felt this was an insult to me as a woman, that my government is looking at me and really saying, you're not quite good enough and you're not quite capable enough, so we're just going to pat you on the head and help you out here. No, that's not the kind of help I needed, because with that comes a whole different, you still have to pay. After all of this, with other states going to CDOT, going down to the Capitol, talking to Colorado Contractors Association, who, by the way, didn't want to help me at all, kind of encouraged me to do the same thing. I decided I'm going to sue the federal government. And we'd lost a federally funded highway job in southwest Colorado in 1989. We were low by about $1,300, not a big chunk, but we were still low, and we were qualified. And the work was awarded to Gonzalez. They were a Hispanic company that had been in this program using these quotas basically since the inception of it. And they were awarded the job. And not only were they given the job at a higher bid, they were also given a bonus, is what they like to call it. The prime was for using a minority contractor. This is all taxpayer dollars. So every one of these jobs that are given based on race and gender at a higher bid, every single one of you paid for out of your pocket. All over something we have absolutely no control over, which is our race or our gender. So I found a great legal foundation, Mountain States Legal Foundation, and they had to vet me and make sure I wasn't some crazy person out there, because there are. So there's crazies on both sides of the fence. It just depends on where you want to find them. They decided to take my case, and they told me at the very beginning, they said, Val, the Supreme Court only takes, I didn't do it thinking I was going to ever end up with the Supreme Court. I just thought, this is wrong. I want to make it right. They asked me if I wanted to sue for money. I said, no. This isn't about money. This is about what's right for us as individuals. That's what this is about. They told me I'd lose through all the appeals courts, and if the Supreme Court decides to take the case, that could take 5 years. And the Supreme Court usually hears around, or they're petitioned about 80,000 cases a year, but they only agree to hear in oral arguments maybe 1%, which is 80 cases a year. So the odds are incredibly low that you're even gonna get heard. And We did. We lost through every appeals court. Thank God I had great attorneys who were coaching me along the way and telling me and educating me. I felt like a first-year law student that didn't read the book. I mean, really, I had to learn a lot. And I'll tell you what, but never once in all of this did I lose my resolve that this was not the right thing, because it was the right thing for the individual. And I don't care what color you are or gender, it doesn't matter to me. So I'll never forget the day I got the call that the U.S. Supreme Court had granted cert that we would be heard in Washington. And I was incredibly humbled by that. And the reason being is I think, oh my God, what an amazing country our founders designed. That I'm just a little Colorado ranch girl and have a little bitty construction company in Colorado, and here we're walking up these steps and they're going to hear our case. Isn't that fabulous? Wow. There is no other country on the planet, nor will there probably ever be another country that will do that. And it made me a believer that one person, one individual, yes, can make a difference. So you have to never let that deter you from anything that you truly believe in your heart is the right thing to do. So we go to the Supreme Court in 95. Here we filed the first papers in 1990, and in 1995 I'm walking up the steps to the U.S. Supreme Court. Had no idea what the ruling would be because they let the more controversial rulings, they announced those in June, which ours was, I think, June 12th, right before they want to get out of town. And we won 5-4. Yay, I'm going, this is great. But they remanded the case. What they did is that we won, but they remanded it back to the federal district courts. I don't want to get all legal. It's in my book a little more detailed if you're interested in that. They narrowly tailored these to where not just anybody could say they're a DBE company. And you had to prove that you were truly disadvantaged. That's what they said. And they really gave a lot of strict scrutiny to that. So I thought, good, we're done. That's great. Now all I want to do is go to work. Well, wrong. It was during the Clinton administration. They said that Adarand, which was the name of our company, the case was moot. We really didn't have standing to be there. And I sued him again. So I ended up with a second appearance in front of the Supreme Court. All 9 justices in that case ruled in my favor that yes, we did have standing to be there. Yes, we could be there. So I'm thinking, great, we're done. Now I can go to work. Wrong. The Justice Department was not complying with the ruling. So I sued him a third time. And I ended up with a third appearance in front of the Supreme Court, second time in oral arguments in 2001. They decided in that case not to rule because there was a controversy on whether it was a state or a federal issue. But the 95 ruling stands. And I didn't stop the whole preferences, but it was one little cog in the wheel of slowing it down. With all of that, I learned a whole lot about how we are as individuals and whether we're going to take a stand or we're not going to really take a stand. And the reason I have a few notes up here is because I have some quotes and I don't want to butcher them because it will really lose their magic. So I want to make sure that I get them correct. Through all of my Supreme Court, 12 years on a legal road, I started working after that on the national level, working on statewide ballot initiative campaigns all across the country, working on to eliminate preferential treatment in the state governments in 3 areas: employment, education, and contracting, and that the state government could not use race, gender, national ethnic, all of that, and any of those, because those are all taxpayer-funded dollars that we're using. And I don't believe our government, period, should make decisions based on something we have absolutely no control over, and that is my gender and my skin color. And I am insulted to think that my government would do that. And to me, it's a slur to half of the human race when they do that. So one of the things that really guided me throughout was Abraham Lincoln. when you get my book, there's a photo of me with my very first steer. I was in 4-H showing cattle, and I named him Abe. I mean, that's how crazy I was about Abe Lincoln. But I truly believe this is a man that had a lot of courage and took a lot of abuse for what he believed in. Lincoln reminds us that honesty and integrity are essential. Because once you forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, you can never regain that respect. He also advocated a vision of continually reaffirming and preaching out to all people. I never forgot that, and I figured I've got to continue reaching out to all. Because if you don't, and just hide behind the curtain, you're never going to make a difference. So for over 3 decades, I had been doing that. I think that the first time I ever took a stand regarding race was when I was 16 years old, and I was in the hayfield, and my grandfather came and got me and said, "Hey, Val, there's 3 guys here to see you." And I went in, got in the pickup with him, and went in, and there was a friend that I'd gotten acquainted with. I used to be in a small little singing group called Sing Out West Grand. It was an offshoot of Up With People. And I'd met the first black American I'd ever seen in my life. And he and I became pen pals. And we talked on the phone occasionally. And he and a couple of friends had decided to surprise me in the hayfield at my grandfather's ranch. Unbeknownst to me, that was way before the era of cell phones or email or any of that. And I saw him, and I couldn't obviously do anything because I had work to do. And I got back in the pickup with my grandfather, and he was seething. And I didn't know why. I couldn't understand it. And he told me right then, he said, "Is that your, as the other guy, there were 2 white guys and Gary was black. Is that your, is Ken, the other guy, your boyfriend?" No, but Gary and I are really good friends, and we write. And he absolutely forbid me to have any more communication with him. And I have never felt such anger. This is my grandfather. I got out of the pickup, and he had a big old pot belly, and his hat was curled down, and his boots were curled up. And I stood toe to toe with him right there, boot to boot, and said, "I will write to him, and he is my friend." And basically, how dare you look at somebody just because of their skin color? That was the first stand I ever took about racism in my life, and I was 16, because I thought it was so inherently wrong that we would treat somebody so different just because their skin's a little darker or a little lighter than mine. And that's probably what started. I do tell this story in my book, but I had not seen Gary in probably 40 years, and I went and found him. I found him, and I interviewed him for this book. And it was really fun to reconnect with some of these very people that gave me those great opportunities to take some stands. Another of Lincoln's principles bolstered me. The one thing that probably came in the most handy as I'm being surrounded by a group of women at the state capitol, being told I was a traitor to my gender and spitting upon me, being shouted down and placards waved in my face and booed and hissed in a whole auditorium, people snapping their fingers. I didn't know what that meant, but it was protest. This one quote from Lincoln helped me. I have to keep over and over in my head throughout the years. It says, "Have the courage to handle unjust criticism." Because you will. Whether you run for office or whether you take a stand, no matter what you do, whether it's in business, there will be times the criticism will be unjust. It takes courage to stand, to keep your feet planted on the ground and know why you're there and why you're doing. Because if you yield to just one false charge, it opens you up to other charges. And knowing that right will eventually make might. It may take a while. And I could not talk about Lincoln without another courageous American who helped shape our national view on human treatment, on equal human treatment. A man who is among the tens of thousands of Americans braved bad weather on a very cold March day in 1865 to hear Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. He was denied entry into the post-inaugural festivities because he was black. This man petitioned President Lincoln for entry. Lincoln immediately escorted him into the White House. When he saw him coming down the hall, he said, "Here comes my friend." That man, that was his friend, was Frederick Douglass. He was born a slave. His early life was full of near nakedness, enduring the beating of the hot summer sun or the bitter cold winters. He had hunger, falling to his knees just to get the crumbs before the household pets got him. It was just really an animal existence. A constant weariness was harsh treatment, and the humiliation upon humiliation upon humiliation, the beatings and the brutality, his own, but far worse to Frederick Douglass was witnessing that of his fellow man or women. So young Frederick, according to his masters, was property. Now, when I talk to you about Frederick Douglass and I talk about slavery, I want you to also think in your mind as I'm going through this about kind of our environment today, because it's a different form of slavery. Douglass later reflected there was pride, pomp, and luxury on the one hand, servility, dejection, and misery on the other. The pride and the pomp of the master was an arrogance to control, an arrogance to humiliate. You know anybody who has a little arrogance today? Well, I think we do. Humiliation is the means by which this end is accomplished, because it is truly humiliating to be dependent or controlled by somebody else. He figured that out. Douglass began to see that slavery was an ideology that was dependent upon the humiliation of others to survive. To enslave another is to forget one's own limits. Don't we currently have a president who's kind of forgotten his limits? I think we have. Douglass saw slave masters and those who stood for slavery did not recognize the limits of nature, God, or good government. Douglass knew this, and he knew that this was a fouled ideology and invoked common sense. He said this: "There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. If slavery is such a good thing, why does no one volunteer to be a slave?" Positive gooders are self-deluded and believe that they will never be confronted by the lie that is the heart of their ideology. They would not wish to be slaves and know it, yet they wish to enslave others and call it good. My friends, I see a whole side of America that's trying to do this to us. They want the do-gooders, and they think it's best for us, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it for themselves. Douglass believed, and although the power of slavery may have appeared to be strong, in fact, it was truly very weak. Like tyranny of any type, it is an empty ideology. Humiliation as a weapon is less useful when people take pride in themselves, not in entitlement programs, not in dependency programs. Douglass recognized that he had what it takes to resist tyranny, and it started with learning. He credits his mother, who against all odds learned to read, and she instilled in him this love for learning, for reading, writing, the world around him. The more Frederick Douglass learned, the more he desired to learn, and set out to prove that, in his words, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. It is our job to tell the truth, so we do not become enslaved. America's history, we can't let America's history be rewritten either. And if you haven't seen the movie America, go see it, because Dinesh D'Souza does a great job of debunking 4 big lies about America. And we've got to tell the truth. So be it. Frederick Douglass decided he would become both knowledgeable and unfit to be a slave. And he also, what awakened in him was this love of liberty. His heart was on fire for God, for liberty, and for the good he might do his fellow man. Although he was enslaved, he found a peace that up to that time had eluded him. In all of this, Frederick Douglass saw the power of humility. He saw what it took to be humble, even in the face of humiliation. The humility was preparing him to be a leader. By humbling himself, he gained the pride and dignity that unfitted him for slavery. It's the same thing in dependency entitlement programs. When you become dependent and feel you're entitled, you really become a slave to somebody else. The arrogance of those who wished to break him was no match for his combination of healthy pride in himself and the humility of his mission. Gaining his pride through humility would give him the strength to find his freedom. For the first 2 decades of his life, Frederick Douglass was repeatedly thrown to the ground where he slept, the ground where he ate, the ground where he was forced when beaten. Douglass had more humiliations thrust upon him in the first 20 years of his life than most people would ever have in a lifetime. In all of this, he could have despaired. He could have allowed his spirit to be broken. He could have even taken his own life. He thought about it. Instead, he held his own, and he believed in who he might become. He was honest with himself, and he recognized that despite all of the humiliations he had suffered, he still needed to be a decent man, a humble man. When Frederick Douglass resisted, which became his master's last beating, he realized, and he discovered a point in existence as a slave that he'd never, ever experienced before. And this was his very natural human spirit emerging. And every one of us have it. He wrote, "Human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man, though it can pity him. And even though this it cannot do long if signs of power do not rise." So having shown himself that he could be powerful in his own self-protection, Frederick Douglass testified, this spirit made me a free man in fact, though I still remained a slave in form. He was not immediately rewarded with his freedom, but boy, I'll tell you what, that feeling of independence and liberty was unlike anything that he had ever experienced in his life. It bolstered his resolve to escape his captivity. After several failed attempts at running away, he succeeded in escaping. Upon doing so, he felt an elation he had never experienced. He says, "A new world had opened up upon me. I lived more in one day than my life as a slave." Douglass became a leading crusader for the abolition of slavery and was the only man to speak on behalf of the female suffrage in the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference in New York. After he seconded the motion to propose that women be granted the right to vote, Douglass said this. This is one of my favorite quotes. "When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. When I stood up for the rights of woman, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act." Douglass was a defender of those who lacked a voice. He loved the words of the Declaration of Independence and its promise of equality and the natural rights of man. After years of educating himself, at first he believed that the Constitution was a slave document. But after studying it and researching it, he found out otherwise. And a lot of soul searching. He really believed the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. Douglass helped instill in Americans a pride in who they were as a people and also who they could become. He displayed a personal confidence as well as a moral confidence. His confidence was not born out of arrogance, but a belief of hard work and a hope that truth will win out. Douglass said about truth, truth was powerful. I'm sure you guys have probably heard this quote before. This is where it came from. Truth was powerful. A single individual armed with the truth was a majority against the world. And that is the truth. Because when you tell the truth, whatever it is, and especially the truth of America, you're in the majority. Lincoln sought out Douglass. I think they only had like 3 personal meetings face to face. And he invited him to a meeting at the White House to discuss the very somber issue of what should happen should they lose the war and what's to become of the slaves. Douglass was very impressed that Lincoln treated him with respect and showed a deep, deep moral conviction about ending the enslavement of his fellow Americans. Douglass, like Lincoln, was a humble man. 2 gentlemen just receiving each other with no reminder of color or their humble beginnings, both of them. You know, America is built on the shoulders of these extraordinary and other humble individuals. I've worked alongside humble individuals, honest, filled with integrity, knowledgeable, just doing their job and never beating their chest about how important or great they are. And people just like you here in Miller's Grill tonight, you're just doing your job and you don't have to beat your chest to do it. We the people are the heartbeat of America. We the people are smart. We know the difference between an arrogant leader and a leader who values and practices humility. I recently read a book about humility in American politics titled Humility by David J. Bob. He wrote this book because he found that our founding fathers were determined to avoid the fate of Rome, and the only way to do that was valuing humility as America's greatest virtue in its people, but especially in its leaders. Humility, these are some of the things that he says, and I'm going to give them to you because I think they're key. Because I see people on both sides of the aisle, whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, it doesn't matter. If you're doing it for yourself, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You have to do it for something far greater than yourself. And only you can figure out what that is. But that is really important. And so many of our leaders today on both sides are doing it. You know, I've experienced the race hustlers on one side, the Jesse Jacksons and the Al Sharptons, and they're hustling is what they're doing. We have those same people on the other side too. And sometimes what they're doing is to elevate themselves and not truly what's right and just. So this is what David Bob says about humility, and I think we've devalued that so much that I think it's important to really express this. Humility is a great virtue, something to be desired and cultivated, and often won only through hard-fought struggles. Humility demands honesty and truth. Humility is not being wimpy. It's being strong, and it brings order to one's soul. Humility is what gives rise to hope. Humility enables courage and points wisdom in the right direction. Humility will never allow one to become a slave, but a servant to fellow citizens. Humility is the helpmate to justice. Humility allows governing for the right reasons. Humility helps guard against pride run amok. Humility is seen in truly, truly great leaders. Arrogance in political life seems to be the rule rather than the exception today. The way David Bob explains it, Arrogance is the opposite of humility. Arrogance is a pride that exceeds the reality of one's merit. And I wager to say, I think we know someone who lives in a big white house on an avenue called Pennsylvania who exceeds the reality of his own merit. That's the guy right there at the top, and there's a whole lot that follow there. Arrogance leads us down a road of not doing what is considered right for America, but what is considered great for a chosen few. And this is what has become our normal. In today's world, being a victim is elevated with just a little bit of adversity and a whole lot of coddling. We've created generations of dependency and a glorified modern form of slavery. If there ever was an example of adversity, it is Frederick Douglass, our fellow American. We all, every single individual, experiences diversity. Nobody is exempt from it. Period. We aren't enslaved physically like Frederick Douglass, but there is adversity. I talk about it in my book, and I lay myself out there in a very personal way. And I do that for a reason. Because the other side has been so masterful at driving through the heart and using emotion to win, so to speak. And I wanted to show I've struggled, I've had adversity. This story may be my story, but it really isn't about me. This is a human story. Every single person will have adversity. The true question is, well, what do you do with it? Do you rise up and move beyond it, or do you shrink away with your hand out? Instead of rising up in the face of adversity like Frederick Douglass did, the preference and dependency programs are the masters who want to control, and we have now created a whining, shrinking, blaming groupthink, and this has now become our normal to some, but not to all. I wrote Bar None, like I said, a very personal story, but it's a human story. What I was trying to do is to hope to inspire with this message. It is far more powerful to rise above adversity than the adversity itself. Had Frederick Douglass not risen above that diversity, he never would have been able to help his fellow man, and he did. We're not silent anymore. We don't buy in, and we know better. We value the individual, the American. That is American, and that is normal. The moment you allow yourself to be defined by your skin color or your gender, to get a preference, and even if it's to get the free stuff like the cell phones or the birth control or whatever it is the moment you have completely voided your right to complain about racism or sexism. As Americans united against all forms of bigotry, we categorically reject the modern-day liberals' perverted view of the world. We will continue to methodically dissect every lie, and it's up to every one of us to do that in our way, until it's exposed in plain view for everyone to see. To the arrogant leftist who refuses to listen, I say this. You cannot stop the conservative movement in the Black or Hispanic or minority community, or women, independent, strong women standing on their own. Because I believe that's a God thing. That's an individual thing. And oh yeah, that War on Women campaign we've all heard so much about, well, they don't speak for this woman. If there is a war on women, it is the government telling half of the human race that they're not good enough. They're not capable enough. That's a war. I don't want my government telling me that. And it is not wise to tick off a whole group of real strong women because we are not victims. Which kind of reminds me of a story. There was an old woman prospector, and she tied up her mule to the hitching post. She got up and she dusted her face off and her clothes off. About that time, a young gunslinger walks out of the saloon with a pistol in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, and he said, "Hey, old broad, have you ever danced?" She goes, "No, I never have. I never did dance. I never wanted to." So the crowd had gathered, and the gunslinger just grinned. He said, "Well, you old bag, you're going to dance now." And he started shooting at her feet. Well, she didn't want to get her feet shot off, so she's hopping around everywhere, and everybody was laughing. And when he finally fired his last bullet, and he holstered his gun, kind of staggered back in, ready to go back into the door of the saloon, she very quietly and quickly turned around and went to her mule and got her double-barreled shotgun. She had, all of a sudden, the crowd got really quiet. And she went, everybody recognized that sound. The gunslinger stopped in his tracks, turned around, and he was staring at both barrels of that shotgun. She held it right to him, and she walked around the back of her mule, and she lifted up the tail, and she said, "Hey, son, have you ever licked a mule's ass?" And he said, "No, ma'am, but I always wanted to." So you see, we are not victims, and that is an injustice met with justice. Many are the plans in a liberal's heart, but it is God's purpose of unity that will prevail. To the arrogant leftists, you see color, we see character. You see black and white, we see good and evil. You play the race card, we will simply smile and cheer on strong Americans like Dr. Ben Carson, Colonel Allen West, and revere the giants that came before us like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. This is, for me, all in the glory and the honor goes to that big guy upstairs, because I'm just simply a messenger. So thank you. Thank you all. Mike, did you want any questions? Or okay, does anybody have any questions or comments? Or sure.
I'm curious, when you were at the Supreme Court, what was the other adjudicant, the people who were opposite you, was like a solicitor general defending the law? Were they more on technical grounds, or what's the kind of arguments you guys faced from the other side on there in the Supreme Court? Were they more that this was required, or were they kind of technical legalistic arguments? What was used against?
Well, they were both, and it was the Solicitor General that argues for, since I sued the government, then the Solicitor General, has to defend the government. And yes, their defense was the programs were needed to remedy discrimination. And so, I go into more of the legal part in my book, and I tried really hard not to leave anybody in the tall grass with the legal part of it, because it gets a little bit complicated. But one of the interesting things that they tried to pin on me, and I was just telling you about this earlier, is when I walked out of the Supreme Court, I had a reporter just shove a microphone in my face and say, "Isn't this a reverse discrimination case?" And I just looked her square in the eye and I said, discrimination is discrimination is discrimination any way you slice it. If you want to put the reverse on it, then is that like saying it's okay? Is it okay to discriminate? So, the government has got to try and defend their side. And my goal was just to really challenge that thinking, and it continues to be that way, just kind of going through the heart. Sure.
I'm an equal opportunity voter, and I think it was good that we did elect a black president. I think it shows who we are. Unfortunately, I disagree very strongly with his policies because I think it takes away a lot of pride. Unfortunately, LBJ did that years ago in '64 when he really had the war on poverty and he went to Southern Appalachia to white folks and he tried to show how poor they were. I lived in Southern Appalachia for a while. These folks are very proud, and what he did was an injustice.
Well, I agree with you. You know, when Obama got elected, I remember saying to some of my LPR buddies that, you know, everybody was really upset about it. I absolutely disagree with his policies. But I thought, thank you, God, we finally maybe gotten over this as a country. Maybe now race will not be the big issue. Unfortunately, it's just gotten a whole lot worse because he's polarized us and he's used it in a way that even, if you've read the news today on with all this immigration stuff, even the very people that supported him in Chicago are outraged at what he's doing. I mean, he's turned his back on so many of, quote unquote, his own people. The fact of the matter is, we're all Americans. But I agree with you. I wasn't totally outraged, and I never dreamt that he could do, one president could do as much damage as he's done. Never dreamt that. Yes.
After your extensive experience with government, especially the judicial system, in scare quotes, what, in your view, is the purpose of government?
Well, I believe we need a strong defense for our nation, and we do have to have a rule of law. Other than that, I'm not sure the purpose is just, because I don't believe they're educating our children in a way that they're going to be competitive in the world. I don't believe that with taxes and trying to take property rights, I don't believe that should be the government's role. There's just every area of life, but I do believe in a very strong defense. It saddens me that he's weakened that. There's been other presidents that have done that too, though, so I shouldn't put all that on him. But I'd say those are the two areas that I would
propose that the sole purpose of government is to protect individual rights. Mm-hmm. Full stop.
I agree. With that comes the defense of our nation, yes. And yes, I agree. Very good. Yeah.
I know that you said that it's in your book, but I'm just curious, maybe a quick Cliff's Notes version of how your reconnection with your pen pal went. What was his experiences on his side of the aisle?
Well, yeah. Out of all the things that Gary Simpson is doing today, I never dreamt he'd be doing this. When I found Gary, we were just thrilled to see each other and still have that incredible bond after 40 years. Gary works he was in the Air Force and is out, but he works in the Air Force as a contract, looking at contracts and awarding them based on race and gender. So we love each other, but so out of all the things, I never imagined that. And he told me that the ones that are awarded most of the contracts in the Air Force are Native Americans. They go to the top of the heap right off the bat. So that's what Gary's doing.
Did he have anything to say about the encounter the day with your grandfather at all?
Oh, yes. I saved every letter that, well, not just Gary, but everybody ever wrote to me, I think. I saved the letter that he wrote to me right after that incident. And I'm so glad I did, because it really reminded me of the intensity of that. And yes, he picked up right away how nervous I was, and because my grandfather was standing there just glaring right down at me, and I knew something wasn't good, and it wasn't because I ran the tractor in the ditch, so it was probably not a good thing, but I never expected that, not in a million years. So yeah, we've talked about it, and I told Gary this, and we'll always be friends, that if it were not for Gary, I don't know. I still think that's so far in me to want to treat the individual right, but I will always love him because he gave me that first stand. He gave me that chance to take that stand. I guess I could have shrunk away from it, but for whatever reason I didn't. And I will always love and admire him for that, no matter what he does as a job. I don't agree with it, and he knows it, but that's what. Anybody else have a question or comment or? Yes.
Off-topic question. When did you start writing the book? How long did it take you to put all that together?
Well, I had saved, like I said, about everything I ever got. All the Supreme Court documents, newspaper clippings. I wrote journals, kept calendars, letters, all of that throughout the years. So I had all that, and I'd actually cataloged it. So that started years and years and years ago, knowing someday I wanted to write a book. I just didn't know when. And I knew I needed somebody to help me because it's just a daunting task when I'd look at all these bins of things. And I met a man actually it was through one of our great LPR grads, Laura Carno. She and I were having lunch one day, and she wanted me to, we were talking about things, and anyway, I told her I really wanted to get the book written, and she gave me the name of a guy, said you need to talk to Glenn, and I did. We met in a coffee shop about a month after that, and I knew within 15 minutes I had my guy. What we did is I started doing audio recordings on my iPad of just telling stories, and then we went and interviewed everybody. I had a list a mile long, I think, of everybody I wanted Glenn to meet and to interview, and we did audio interviews, and with all of that, whether it was my talking or the interviews, we turned them into transcripts, and then through the transcripts, we started pulling the story together. So the actual writing, that all took place from a year ago, January, to about now, about June, July, and then we started the writing in earnest in July, and then I had the manuscript, the first draft of it done in November. And then it's just been editing and things like that. It just got released the end of May, 1st of June. You're welcome. Anybody else? I'd be happy if you have any other questions or anything. I'll be around, and I'm going to have a beer and be happy to talk to you. Okay, great. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. As she mentioned, she'll be sticking around having a beer. She's got books back there if you're interested in buying them and getting signatures.